Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, June the 26th, 2025. Almost 100 years ago, in a couple of weeks, we will be celebrating, if that's the right word, the 100th year anniversary of the Scopes trial, which has often been described as the trial of the century. It pitted William Jennings Bryan, a Democratic politician who ran unsuccessfully for president several times, against Clarence Darrow, one of America's greatest legal minds and intellectuals. Our guest today is Brenda Wineapple. Her book, Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, came out last year. And I'm thrilled that Brenda is joining us today from a sweltering New York to talk about the 100th year anniversary of the Scopes trial. Brenda, was it indeed the trial of the century? Is that a fair way of describing Scopes?
Yeah, I think it was. That's something that newspapers like to make up because it sells newspapers. The trial of the century, Sacco and Vanzetti, Scottsboro, even O.J. Simpson is a trial of the century. This is the 20th century. And this definitely was, when you think there were 200 journalists, imagine that, in 1925 that descended on a small town in Dayton, in Tennessee, to cover this trial, which also got not only in the front pages of the United States, but it was covered internationally. So that means something, even though, unlike Sacco and Vanzetti, it wasn't about anarchism or immigrants. And, unlike the Scottsboro boys, it wasn't about race ostensibly. But it was very interesting that so many people were so riveted by this trial.
We've done several shows with my old friend Adam Hochschild. I'm sure you know his book, American Midnight, about the period after the First World War.
Of course, yeah.
Set the scene in 1925. How far beyond American Midnight and the authoritarianism and the violence of the post-First World War age had America gone in 1925?
Well, it's an interesting question because when you think 7 years, war is over in 1918, 7 years have passed to 1925, when that's really not that long. So the questions that Hochschild talks about, immigration, xenophobia, assassinations, deportations, I think something like 10,000 people were deported. That from the pre-war into the post-war period continued, particularly because it was the Russian Revolution, so people were accused of being Reds. There was in 1919 something that was called Red Summer, not because of Reds as in Bolsheviks, but because so many Black men and women in prosperous towns were massacred. I think the most famous one that people know today is the 1921 Tulsa massacre. So you have a lot of the same ferment that was going on before the war, after the war, but then you also have the war, which was so unthinkably horrible. It was such a terrible slaughter, and people didn't know for what reason that happened. So there was a great deal. That's the period, in the 20s now, it's called the Roaring 20s, but as I often say, it wasn't roaring for everyone, as people were out of work. As I said, it
was more warring than roaring. And of course, this was the period of Republican presidents after Woodrow Wilson. Adam talks about the Palmer raids and the appearance of a stronger American state, the rise of J. Edgar Hoover, of course, perhaps the most influential law and order man in American history.
Right.
How important, in your view, Brenda, is that the building of an American state? Before the First World War, America was not just an agricultural society, but a society without much of any kind of federal state.
Well, I think that really, until you get to the New Deal, you don't entirely have a federal state. But you do have people like, ironically, William Jennings Bryan, who, as you said, ran on the Democratic ticket for president 3 times, and he was a progressive. But at the same time, he was edging toward what you're calling a federalized state when you think that you have prohibition that was recently passed. And prohibition is a federal law. It outlaws the manufacture, the distribution, and the drinking of alcohol. So that is a kind of federal state. But then, of course, you've got Coolidge, who's reputedly said the business of America is business, and he loved laissez-faire politics and ideas in that sense. But I want to add something else, because there's another side to this, which is, I mentioned the Roaring '20s, but it's also called the Jazz Age, and you have writers like Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Willa Cather, all publishing. You have movies taking off. You have radio, kind of social media of its day. The Scopes trial was the first trial that was actually broadcast on radio. You can imagine that. And at the same time, in internationally, you have Hitler publishing Mein Kampf, 1925. So it's a very interesting time where you have various strands of American culture kind of coming together in this very unusual, it seems to me, tapestry, or maybe not unusual, judging from 2020's perspective, but certainly unusual in 1925, having just fought this war and having the world really changing in many ways.
H.L. Mencken made a name for himself. Perhaps he had a name beforehand, but I think he was the one who coined the trial, the monkey trial. Tell us about the trial, the background, who was involved, and what it was about.
Sure, it's interesting. In 1925, the Tennessee State Legislature passed a law that basically banned the teaching of evolution in the public schools. It was called the Butler Act because it was a local farmer, John Washington Butler, who he thought evolution was terrible. He didn't know anything about evolution, but he had heard that it was really bad. And the law itself said that you couldn't teach any story that denies the story of divine creation as taught in the Bible, and instead that man is descended from a lower order of animal. At the same time, the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, which also wasn't very old, as you probably discussed with Adam Hochschild, was formed in 1920, coming out of World War I, and before that, pacifism of World War I. And in that particular case, the ACLU, looking for test cases so that people would be aware of their civil rights, heard about this law, and they advertised in the couple Tennessee papers, and said that if anyone was willing to violate the law, break the law, basically, that they would defend that person. So people in the town got together. Long story short, a young man, biology teacher, substitute teacher, stepped up and he said, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution.
Is this John Scopes?
That's John Scopes.
Yeah, a man who has become very, very famous, almost accidentally, I guess.
Yeah, not only accidentally, he could have become more famous because, as if it were 2025, movie moguls descended on Dayton, Tennessee.
Yeah, he's got the looks of a movie star. He's a nice-looking fella.
Nice-looking young guy, and they said, you want to be in a movie? Do you want to write a book? We can make a bestseller, which I'm sure they could have at that time. And he was very unassuming. He really didn't want fame or celebrity. He was doing the right thing, hard enough to believe. And he disappeared for many years. It wasn't until the 1960s that he reemerged. He actually, after the trial, there were a group of scientists who passed around a hat so that he'd have enough money to go to study postgraduate at the University of Chicago, which he did. So he just had a life.
Would it be fair? I mean, the superficial reading of the trial is that it pitted ignorance against scientific enlightenment. Is that a fair way of putting it, or is it more complicated than that?
To me, it's more complicated. You know, traditionally you read the trial as science versus religion. Yeah, science versus religion, or science versus faith. But one of the things that was interesting to me is the fact that nobody knew the science, nobody understood the science, and Darwin had published in 1859 The Origin of Species, and the theory of evolution was settled at this particular juncture. It wasn't really an issue in the scientific community, in the education community, and in fact, the textbook, the state authorized textbook that Scopes taught from, mentions evolution. It also mentions eugenics, but putting that aside for a second. So it was settled. That's what we call settled. Settled theory. Nobody really understood what a scientific theory was. Nobody had disproved evolution. In the textbook, it merely said evolution was change, didn't threaten anything. And the scientists who came to Dayton to testify taught Sunday school. So I wanted to know really what was going on, because it seemed to me that there was a proxy fight that was occurring, because it really couldn't be about what it was said to be about. And I think people on the ground in 1925 knew that. I think we lose that to a certain extent, but they had some inkling of that, even though someone like Brian, who'd been hired by a fundamentalist group, he went to Dayton, he said, to fight a duel to the death on behalf of Christianity, because he felt, again, he didn't understand the science either, but what he felt is because of the war, other things that he misunderstood, but because of the war, people had lost their moral bearing. And if we could only get God back, his version of God, of course. He and the fundamentalists, the easiest way to understand them is they read the Bible literally.
Brenda, we've done a lot of shows on the challenges, the history, the disappearance of progressive populism. William Jennings Bryan was, would it be fair to call him a progressive populist? That was his politics. He was, I don't know what you call him, a left-wing man, but certainly not a conservative representative of ordinary America or of small-town America. How would you position him politically, both in terms of his history and then his turn in the 1920s? The stuff I've read on Bryan, I think I've read a couple of his biographies, suggest that he changed dramatically in the 20s.
I myself don't feel that he changed. I mean, if you go all the way back, he was a Democrat when Democrats could be very progressive, as he was. I'll come back to that. But it also meant that, quote unquote, the people needed to decide what was right. If you go back to the time in which Bryan was born, right, was really during the Civil War, just before the Civil War. What Democrat meant is that you could vote, the people of a state could vote for or against slavery. All right. So in that particular sense, the people could decide, as the people did decide in many places, to keep the institution of slavery. So in that sense, that aspect of the Democratic Party was not progressive, could not be progressive. In fact, one of the times that Bryan ran for president, he had a former Confederate general as his vice president. So it's interesting in that particular regard. In 1924, when he wasn't running, he went to the Democratic National Convention, and there was a groundswell of movement to censure the Ku Klux Klan, which was very, very powerful in the 1920s, as you doubtless know. readers, your listeners doubtless know, Brian wouldn't censure them. He said they were just misguided. It's kind of like saying there are good people on both sides, you know. So in that sense, he was a progressive, as you said. He was for the common people. He was against the plutocrats. He was against monopolies. He believed that, in point of fact, people should have a share in their government. He was for women's suffrage. You see, so progressive is itself, and maybe you're right when you say populist progressive or progressive populist. He could be both what we would consider very conservative, even to being reactionary, at the same time as being very progressive. What that to me is fascinating. It's fascinating because of the world in which we live now, and it's fascinating then because people aren't monolithic in that particular sense. I don't think he changed. His views, for example, about race were always the same.
Yeah, and on prohibition, he was very much in favor of prohibition, wasn't
Very
he?
much so. And but you could also argue that prohibition, from some points of view, from his certainly, was progressive because he,
Yeah, and I mean, I always understood
right.
prohibition to have been a movement begun and driven by women. I know you include Elizabeth Cady Stanton in your narrative. How does the issue of women's rights, voting rights, and perhaps the early history of American feminism fit into the Scopes trial?
Very much so, because one of the defenders of Scopes, a man, as everybody was, far less famous than Darrow, was named Dudley Field Malone. He had been, like Brian in Wilson's cabinet. He was a, quote, progressive, much more so than a real one, much more so than Brian. And when women in 1917 were picketing the White House because Wilson more or less ignored his promise to women who helped him become elected, his promise that he would help pass the suffrage amendment. So they were picketing the White House, and Wilson sent out the police to arrest them. Dudley Field Malone took up their, they were actually sent to prison. And Dudley Field Malone quit Wilson's cabinet angrily and defended them, so that you see that there was this kind of, again, Wilson is a progressive. Well, he wasn't so eager to have women vote, but this was definitely filtering into this trial, because insofar as it's a proxy trial, you see people are anxious, they're nervous, there's so much change happening. Now women have the vote, you know, Black men and women who've come up from the South to the North and making prosperous communities, that threatened people. Women having the vote threatened people. You can see where I'm going with this. So feminism and the women's movement is an enormous, again, shadow but important component in what happened in this particular trial. Of course, I have to point out that as Doris Stevens, who was the suffragette who was at the trial and had married Dudley Malone, she said, well, of course, the jury is all male. She made note of that, certainly. But in any event, so this is part of the ferment, what I'm calling the kind of excitement and the anxiety that brings you this trial and focuses this trial and gives you a sense of what this trial, some of the issues that are behind the trial and that people understand are being.
So you're suggesting that all these complicated forces of history somehow converge, and of course, it's not possible to do any thinking or writing about American history without involving the issue of race. You talked already about William Jennings Bryan, sort of Confederate inclinations in some ways. W.E.B. Du Bois was, of course, the best known American intellectual of his age. Was there a racial component of this? You've noted the appearance of theories of eugenics. We have a show coming up next week about theories of race and white superiority. Was that somehow implicitly or explicitly involved in this trial?
Oh, I think it's both explicit and implicit. Certainly many in the Black communities felt that, you know, that this was about race because they understood, as many whites and as Darrow did, and as the defense did, that the theory of evolution itself helped make absolutely indefensible the idea that racial hierarchies could be fixed and separate and consigned to superior and inferior. And one of the scientists who went to Dayton to testify, a Harvard geologist, he said basically the discovery of bones, for example, linked together the what he said called the white, yellow, brown, and red races in this particular sense. So, and Darrow said the other side, Brian, talk as if God, made a white man, a black man, a blue man, which isn't how we understand or they understood evolution. So it was very, very definitely the case that race was involved. And even you mentioned that that Mencken coined the term monkey trial. So the idea that we're related to what uh, Brian called brute ancestry, that is such an anathema to him, really. That in everything that in Dayton, there were monkey trinkets and monkey dolls and chimps strolling and rolling around in the street, suggests that there's an anger here and an anxiety that really isn't about evolution per se. It's really about something else that is going on.
And that's something else in American history is all too often, for better or worse, race.
Yeah.
Lincoln, of course, is a very divisive figure, Brenda. On the one hand, everyone acknowledges his brilliance as a writer. On the other hand, he has a history of racism and not the most likable of characters. How does that play out in your narrative?
Well, just one thing on the idea of race, because you mentioned W.B. Du Bois, who actually wrote about the Scopes trial in his magazine, The Crisis, and he basically said that Dayton is America, which is, I think, is important to understand. That he understood what was going on in Dayton wasn't about, what goes on in Dayton stays in Dayton. No, Dayton reflects something much larger. And Mencken knew that, but Mencken also gave voice to some of the worst and most bigoted ideas in America. He wasn't always, in his magazines, American Mercury, and before that, SmartSat, he published Black people, he published women. He really did love good writing, and he was a good writer, but some of his views, again, on Blacks, on Jews, on minorities, were deeply offensive. And in one way, much of what we have come to think of as the Scopes so-called monkey trial comes from Mencken, because he went there. He was one of the journalists who went to Dayton. And if you know anything about Mencken, he was from Baltimore. He lived his whole life in Baltimore. He didn't really like to move that much, but he went to Tennessee too.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Dayton. It's named after Dayton, Ohio, which is only well known, I think, because of the Bosnia talks. I'm guessing that this was this was deep Jim Crow territory, segregation. How much of Dayton was white versus black?
Well, it was mainly white. There's no doubt about that. I forget the actual numbers, but it's like a handful of Black people. And there's, certainly it's all Protestant churches, different denomination of Protestant churches. And there was really, it seems to me, only one, maybe there were two liberal Protestant churches. I forget the number of churches given the population of Dayton, which was only 2,000, which was huge number of churches. So this was a church-going community, but Tennessee itself was divided in the Civil War, and part of Tennessee joined the Union, and part of the Union, the vice president was under Lincoln was from Tennessee, and he was a white supremacist. But let's leave that aside for a minute. But I wouldn't say that Jim Crow was first and foremost on people's mind in Dayton, because they hadn't been, these were these were small-time people. These were not plantation owners. These were not people who actually harbored prejudices in the way we think of them, even though it's Tennessee. If there's prejudice at all, it's a different kind. It's North versus South. It's urban versus rural.
So it's the Williams. It would be William Jennings Bryan territory. We haven't talked yet about Clarence Darrow. He often portrayed as a brilliant but arrogant man. What's your take on him? Does he represent progress and science and reason?
To me, he does, definitely. I'm surprised to hear that he is represented as arrogant, because it seems to me, and I've read a lot of his cases and a lot of his
We knew he was smart, and he wasn't shy about that.
Oh, no, but he had a way of talking to juries. He never talked down, he was never condescending, he was certainly not an elitist. He would go into the Dayton courtroom wearing a lapel pin. It said there were, just 3 letters, LLL. Somebody asked him what it meant. He said, "Live and let live." He was an avowed agnostic, which meant that he did not he did not believe in God, but he was open-minded. He said, if it happens or somebody proves it, fine, I'm okay with that. He believed everybody, or he thought everybody needed something, and if that's something that you need is religion, so be it. If you need alcohol, so be it. You see what I'm saying in that way? He was called by Lincoln Steffens, the journalist, an attorney for the damned, because he would never prosecute a case. He was a defense attorney, and he would take on anyone whose rights seemed to be violated. He went, on one hand, he defended Leopold and Loeb, another trial of the century and crime of the century. 2 teenagers who killed a 3rd teenager just for the hell of it. And they admitted it. It was a horrible crime. It is a horrible crime. They said they were guilty. They were happy to say they were guilty. Darrow didn't defend them because he thought they were innocent. He just thought that they should get life sentences because he hated capital punishment. By the same token, that was right before the Stokes trial. Right afterwards, he goes quickly to Detroit to defend a Black family and friends who are being assaulted, attacked by a group of white supremacists, probably members of the Klan. So they shot at the mob and they killed someone. So they're on trial for murder, and he got them acquitted. I mean, in 1925. So he was able to tell people, just think of what it feels like to be someone else. If you're white, think about what it feels to be Black, and knowing that history. He was an unusual man in that particular way.
So I'm getting the sense that you really admire him in
Well,
contrast
I do. But as I said about Bryan, everybody's complicated, because Bryan has some good aspects to him too, good qualities. Darrow, by the same token, out in California, but in LA, not San Francisco, he was put on trial twice for presumably or allegedly trying to bribe a juror. So nobody knows if he did or not. I mean, the evidence is inconclusive. Eventually, the LA district attorney dropped the case, but I think basically Darrow wasn't allowed to go back to California. So, and there were people who were farther on liberal or progressive politics than he was, who didn't like the fact that he could take on corporations, for example, not take on as in indict them, but defend them.
What was Brenda, the political response officially? I mean, was it Harding or Coolidge was president at the time?
Coolidge.
Did Coolidge get involved, and were leftists like Debs involved? I mean, he was out of prison, I think, by then. Did it impact on national politics?
He was no. Debs was very ill by that time. And he had actually, Darrow in his younger days and Debs' younger days, had actually defended Debs. Coolidge didn't get involved at all. Coolidge is, basically, if he's going to do anything, he's going to sort of hide out in Vermont. So it didn't have political ramifications in that particular sense. But you have to remember, excuse me, or it's important to remember, that, as I mentioned before, the Ku Klux Klan is extremely powerful politically at this particular time. They're in state legislatures, they're in governors' houses, they're all over the place. The interesting thing politically about the trial is, of course, Scopes was found guilty. The ACLU wanted to get this to ultimately the Supreme Court, which it didn't do. But because Darrow, against the wishes of the ACLU, tried the case in the papers, and because Bryan actually was made to look ridiculous in many ways, there was no legislation like this that was able to get through other states. So it did have that kind of impact and tamp down the direction in which fundamentalists were going. They were not a political organ at that time. But as one scientist pointed out, don't get too comfortable. They are going underground, these fundamentalists, and they will reemerge as a political organization. So that's interesting. So long term, it did have a very decided political effect.
You very, very bold in this book, Keeping the Faith. The book, Edward Larson's Summer for the Gods, which I think won the Pulitzer Prize and has always been acknowledged as the authoritative version of Scopes before yours. Why did you write this book? Did you feel that Larson's book, I once visited Larson in LA, he's a delightful fellow. Did you feel that there was something missing? Why did you need to, let's say, update it, but add a new book to the corpus?
Well, first of all, I wasn't updating it. I was a different perspective. Larson's very wonderful book was published in 98, I think it was, 97, 98. So that's
98, won the Pulitzer in 98.
So that's over 25 years itself. It's almost a different world, a different generation. From my point of view, and what he did, as I said, very well. I mean, who could say he didn't? Why would you? But I'm coming from the trial from a very different point of view. I'm not arguing that it's, as we said earlier, it's not a religious trial. It's not about science. People didn't even understand the science, as I said. It's about a cultural moment. And I'm interested in reading the arguments pro and con and reading the culture at the time, which is a different perspective. So it wasn't that I was updating it, no reason to. It's just it's the same trial, but it's a different angle. I bring to it, sort of different questions about what it meant and where it fit in the culture, political culture, literary culture, social culture, feminist culture, even religious culture of the 1925, and how those various cultures intersected and spoke with one another. I don't think you can talk about the trial without talking about the way in which Congress shut the door on immigration, or the way it was afraid of so-called Bolsheviks or Reds, or the way in which Black men and women were being lynched. None of those things, it seems to me. So, as I think you said earlier, it's a kind of funnel through which we see a lot of those things. Otherwise, it makes no sense that it was the trial of the century.
Right. And the New York Times review was very strong. The reviewer said that implicitly, at least in the book, you're talking about the 1920s, sorry, not the 1920s, the 2020s. Sometimes they wish you'd been a bit more explicit. How relevant is the book to today? I mean, the trite assumption would be that America hasn't changed much, and in Trump and MAGA, you can go back to William Jennings Bryan, and the debate about what should and shouldn't be taught in American schools today is not that different from the debate in the 1920s. Is there any accuracy to that, or is the America of the 2020s a foreign place, as
No.
somebody remarked about history once?
Oh, no. It right. Well, when you do any kind of history, it's almost like learning a foreign language in a sense. But as I'm saying that the issues that are being debated in terms of the trial or raised at the trial really are about freedom, and freedom to worship or not to worship, what it is we worship, who decides we worship, and then extending that to who decides what we learn, what we can read. And since these are obviously very present kinds of questions when you're talking about removing books from libraries, or, forbidding certain things to be taught in schools, or, talking about abrogation of civil rights or reproduce all of those things, um, it's all part of an aspect, I think, of American culture that is very, I wouldn't say the same because the terms are different, but it has to do with bigotry and prejudice and intolerance, which is unfortunately part of a long-standing heritage. But it's obviously different today in many ways for all the reasons you alluded to, whether it's the MAGA movement or you didn't mention, but social media, all of those things that did, partisanship. But I think in the similarities, it's not a cliche to say there are similarities, but at the same time, what's important is that it makes us more vigilant, knowing our history, knowing that people did stand up for what they considered to be values and would actually fight it out in a court dramatically and allow people to air these views, I think is really important. And I really think it shows us something about integrity, and what it means to fight for or argue for what one believes, and what.
You in your biography, you on your website at least, I won't say you boast, but you explain that you write from New York. That's your perch in observing the world. We mentioned Adam Hochschild earlier. His wife is also a remarkable woman. She's been on my show several times. She's the author of a couple of very influential books, Strangers in Their Own Land and Stolen Pride, in which Ali, who's a sociologist at UC Berkeley, living over the Bay in Berkeley, lives or goes to spend some time in Kentucky and I think Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that to write about, and I'm not sure if you ventured to Tennessee to write the book, but do you think to write about the world that William Jennings Bryan was defending, perhaps in a nostalgic, often irrational, perhaps anti-scientific manner, one needs to spend some time in small town America?
I've spent a lot of time in small town America. I'm not from New York. I just happen to live here now. And I think it's very important. It's a very big country with a lot of different people. So when you say, well, Tennessee, Jim Crow, I say, no, not so fast, really, in that particular sense. And there's enormous prejudice, each part of the country against another part of the country. And the only way we begin to, I think, understand that is by moving around. By the same token, we can't move around in history. I mean, as your other guests have suggested, there are no flying carpets that'll take us back to 1925 or 1025 or any period at all. So we do the best we can with the materials that we find and try to find as many materials, primary materials, people speaking, living, acting, as possible. So I think it's a kind of dialectic. You move, you see, you talk, but at the same time, you have to sit, you have to think, you read, you consult, try to, in some sense, empathize. Whether it's empathizing by going somewhere, or empathizing, saying, what did they mean in this newspaper of 1925? Why were they saying what they were saying? What's the larger frame? So I think both are true, in some particular sense, both staying and moving.
And finally, Brenda, America has often been the object of the world's amusement, sometimes in a very patronizing and unfair way. How was this reported internationally? Did Europeans report this as if, oh, those dumb Americans, they
Yes.
look at their
Yeah,
primitive intellectual state?
absolutely. You want to talk about prejudice, then, go to Europe and then look at America, or just as America might look to, I don't know, look to Algeria. You see what I'm saying in that way. So in the newspapers, certainly in Britain, and I think Bertrand Russell was quoted, they were saying things like, "This is America, only in America." This is the place that hang the witches. So yeah, there was a lot of kind of disbelief because, as I said, some of these arguments on the surface anyway had already been fought and won in the 1870s and 1880s. So this is a long time coming. So people were astonished. And it sold papers because it is so astonishing.
So what are you going to be doing to celebrate, if that's the right word, in a couple of weeks, the Scopes trial? What should we all be doing, Brenda?
I'm going to go, per your question of a couple of minutes ago, I'm going to be in Tennessee. Where else?
Where else, indeed? So I wish you
Forward to that.
an early July 4th. Congratulations, not you personally, but perhaps the country, and for writing the book, an important new book, very well reviewed. Is it out in paperback yet, Brenda?
No, not until September.
Well, the publisher should have done it for the 100th anniversary.
Well, they don't listen to the writer.
The wisdom of publishers. Well, congratulations, Brenda, on the book.
With you.
And have fun in Tennessee. And we will talk again, I'm sure, when you come out with a new project. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.